Okay, we are recording as you just heard, I imagine. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We are delighted to have Emily May of the Xerxes Society with us, and we are going to learn all about night pollinators, which I personally don't think of that much, so I'm really excited to hear more. First, a few reminders, and I will put, as always, put the links in the chat shortly, but I want to get Emily speaking as soon as possible. We are recording this. We will put it on our YouTube channel probably tomorrow. Our next brown bag lunch is Wednesday, December 7th, noon to 1. We do not have a December monthly presentation just because of holidays, so our next one will be January, and that's the 28th with Dr. Avalon Owens. And actually, it's interesting, it's sort of related to this because they will be talking about the impacts of artificial lights on insects, which one would think would be related to night stuff. So anyway, excited. I'm excited for both this one and that one. And now I am delighted to introduce Emily May. She is a pollinator conservation specialist and the agricultural conservation lead with the Xerxes Society's pesticide program. She received a Master's of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University and has studied pollinator habitat restoration, bee nesting habits, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. Her work with Xerxes since 2015 has focused on supporting crop pollinators through habitat creation and protecting bees and other beneficial insects from pesticides. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily now. We are requesting that you hold questions till the end. You feel free to put them in the chat, but we won't be interrupting the presentation to answer them. So I will just keep track at the end and start making sure that the questions get asked. All right, Emily, you are on. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the introduction and for having me here. I'm excited to talk with you about pollination after dark. Over the last few years, we have learned a lot about how much other insects, including the ones that are active at night, are contributing to pollination of our wild plants and our crop plants, and how much they're affected by all of the artificial lighting that we have around our houses and roads. I'm actually very excited to hear that you have Avalon Owens coming to talk because she knows so much about this topic, but I hope you'll learn a few new things from me in this presentation and start to get motivated to turn off the lights at night. So when we think about pollination, I feel like everybody is probably going to picture a bee or a butterfly or a hummingbird that's visiting a flower on a bright sunny day. And you'll often see nursery plants that are labeled as butterfly or bee friendly. In gardens, your garden, if you have a pollinator garden, is probably designed mostly to attract this type of pollinator. Other daytime pollinators include flies, wasps, beetles. Most of these pollinating insects that we picture here are diurnal. That's a word meaning that they're active during the daytime. If you search for images of pollinators, again, you will mostly see daytime pollinators dominating the results. It's much easier to photograph a pollinator visiting a flower during the daytime. Same with iNaturalist. If you're going to some kind of monitoring program, you're again going to see mostly results that are dominated by daytime pollinators. But there's also some truly beautiful insects that come out at night. This is the rosy maple moth, which is a pretty inconspicuous green caterpillar that feeds on a variety of different maple tree leaves. As an adult, it is this incredible mix of colors, and you might recognize it. It starts its activity in the late afternoon, so it's present at some of the daytime hours, but it feeds and mates and lays eggs at night. So what else is out there at night? Insect activity is actually, on average, a third higher at night. More than half of invertebrates are active at night. And there's a growing body of research that's starting to really shed light on how important moths and other nighttime visitors are for pollination in wild plant communities, as well as in agricultural crops. There were studies that were done in Arkansas. This is from Stephen Robertson, who did a study in apples in Arkansas that found that nocturnal insect visitors, especially moths, contribute significantly to apple pollination at night. Pollination over the night shift was almost equal to that of what was contributed by daytime pollinators in terms of fruit set. And there's also experiments that have looked at blueberries and other fruit crops and observational evidence that nocturnal pollinators visit a whole wide range of other crops. But these animals are really understudied for mostly good reason. We are daytime animals ourselves, and so it can be challenging to convince a researcher to go out overnight to conduct that kind of field work. But there's a lot more to learn. What do we know at this point? Nighttime pollination has been observed in almost 2/3 of flowering plant orders. It's more common in plants that are adapted to live in dry conditions, which is something that we can talk a little bit more about why that is. But we're starting to see just how important moths and other nighttime visitors are for pollination of these wild plant communities. So moths pollinate a whole diversity of plant families and species, and that makes these plant pollinator networks, this is kind of a simple drawing of one, much more complex than what they appear during the day. So this is an example here of how nocturnal pollinators might be contributing a whole lot of interactions and functions to a plant network. And this is just thinking about moths. There are likely a whole bunch of other kinds of insects, flies and beetles, that are also contributing to the pollination, the movement of pollen from plant to plant. We also know that artificial lighting is a threat to these nocturnal pollinators. The more that we learn about nocturnal pollinators, by the time we've learned it, there's more lights on at night. More than half of the United States experiences some level of light pollution at night, and the area that's affected by light is growing every year. Artificial lighting can disrupt navigation by nocturnal insects, reduce flower visits, and reduce fruit sets by nocturnal pollinators. But we will talk more about this in the solutions part towards the end. But let's talk about why and how pollination happens after dark. So there's lots of different kinds of pollinators that visit flowers during the day. There are some flowers that actually close themselves up and tuck in for bed when darkness falls. New England aster would be an example of that. It's a process called floral nyctinasty, when that's a word meaning flowers opening or closing petals at dusk in response to the onset of darkness. But there's also flowers that open exclusively at night or have evolved to attract the kind of pollinators that are out during the dark. So this is a picture of showy evening primrose in my colleague Caitlin's yard at night, opening up for business. Evening primrose got its name from its nyctinasty, which is that behavior of opening up petals at dusk. And there's an evening primrose of some kind that is native to every part of the continental US. So there's evening primrose all over the country. So with all those daytime pollinators around, why would a plant bloom at night? So a review of all the plant families and species found that nocturnal pollination tends to be associated with the species that have some kind of water stress. So flowering at night, flowering is a very water intensive process. There's a really huge difference in light intensity between a sunny day and even a full moon night. That's a difference of about 1 million in terms of light intensity. Nighttime brings higher humidity, lower temperatures, lower wind speeds, all of which means lower loss of water. So plants that face water stress might gain an advantage by flowering at night when they're less likely to lose that water through evapotranspiration. This means they can maybe produce flowers that are larger or maybe provide more nectar rewards, other things that can attract pollinators in. So the flowers pictured here are a species of cactus that's found in the Sonoran Desert. They put out these incredibly showy blooms for one night, and then they look pretty unremarkable for the rest of the year. But they can only do that by flowering at night. So in other cases, it could be that they've really evolved to benefit specifically from nighttime pollinator visits. So there's many flowers that are actually visited by both daytime and nighttime pollinators, but some flowers have evolved features that are especially attractive to nighttime visitors. So for the animals that are out after dark, light is limited, and most animal eyes aren't very well adapted to seeing in the dark. So unlike flowers that are appealing to daytime visitors that have bright, flashy colors, that have the UV reflectance, most flowers that are pollinated at night are pale colored to reflect what little light there is available. So this makes them easier to see for the animals that are relying on their eyes. And then another common feature is actually the production of strong fragrance. So following your nose is easier than following your eyes in the dark. And many of the nighttime flowers are fragrant. There's also some theories that some nocturnal flowers are more likely to retain or produce heat that attracts pollinators during the lower temperatures at night. Most insects are ectothermic, meaning they're not producing their own heat, but they do need to stay above a certain temperature to stay active. So flowers that are able to retain heat captured from the sun or that produce their own heat, that might be something that attracts pollinators to visit them at night. So the thermogenesis, or the ability to produce their own heat, is a feature that you've seen. This is a tropical plant family. Beetles will crawl into this flower to stay warmer and more active through the night. So insect pollinators may be able to detect those flower temperatures and visit those flowers to warm themselves up. So who are the nocturnal pollinators? There's really kind of four main groups of nocturnal pollinators here in the US. Moths are the most diverse and the largest group of those. They are found all over the world where there's flowering plants. And then the rest of these nocturnal pollinator groups tend to be more diverse and more concentrated at lower latitudes or be closer to the equator. But up here in the Northeast, we have moths and beetles, even some crepuscular bees, which we'll talk about, and I'll tell you what that means. In the Southwest US, there are also bat pollinators at night. So yeah, I'll talk about crepuscular bees in just a minute. There's also some species of beetles that are night pollinators, and to a lesser extent, flies, crickets, ants, thrips, geckos. There's a lot of documented nighttime visits by other groups of animals. But I sort of divided this talk up into, we're talking about daytime pollinators, and we're talking about nighttime pollinators, but actually we were talking about a whole 24-hour cycle. So there's a lot of pollinators that don't fall neatly into a daytime or a nighttime categorization. Some of them fall into the twilight zone. So there are many pollinators that are most active around dawn and around dusk. And the term to describe this is crepuscular, which is Latin for twilight zone. The crepuscular pollinators, or the dusk and dawn pollinators, there's lots of moths, and there's also some bees that fall into this. This is a hawk moth or a hummingbird moth. Sometimes you might actually mistake it for a hummingbird based on the way it flies. So moths are not strictly nocturnal. There are many that are crepuscular and also many that fly during the daytime. In the bee group, most bees are active during the day, but there are over 200 species that are active in the twilight zone and a few that fly at night, actual nocturnal species of bees. So there's as I said, most bees are at day active, but there are a few groups of bees that are active at dusk until there's very little light left in the sky. So this slide shows two different species of Lasioglossum, which is a genus of sweat bee. The bee on the left, Lasioglossum incompletum, is a day active species that is a generalist on many different flower species. The bee on the right, Lasioglossum texanum, is a crepuscular species of sweat bee, so dusk active, a twilight zone pollinator. And like many of the bees that come out at twilight, it's a specialist on the evening primrose family that start blooming at dusk. So I'm wondering what differences you're noticing about these two bees. I want to point out the size difference between these structures on the tops of their heads. So if you think bees have 2 eyes, they actually have 5. These 3 round things on the tops of bees' heads are simple eyes called ocelli. They take in light and they help bees orient their position relative to the sun. So it makes a lot of sense that a crepuscular bee, which is active in less light, would have much larger eyes, both their regular compound eyes as well as their simple eyes that are helping them navigate. So they're taking in more light when they're flying for their evening primrose adventures. Crepuscular bees tend to be more common in warmer places where nighttime isn't bringing this threat of cold temperatures. But we do have some crepuscular bees here in New England, like the squash bee, which is commonly active at dawn and dusk. And they come out 1 or 2 hours earlier than most other squash pollinators, like bumblebees, and they're taking full advantage of the flower's resources. So I made the mistake of trying to study squash bees for my senior thesis in college in Vermont, and my sleep schedule did not match with squash bee, which came out so early in the morning. So I changed projects. So we have bees that are crepuscular, they're flying in dim light, but there's a couple species of truly nocturnal bees. So there's a couple of groups of bees that have independently evolved adaptations that allow them to fly in very, very low light on moonlit nights. So there's one species that's actually even been seen flying without the moon. So this is the large carpenter bee up on the top, which is native to Southeast Asia. And it typically is out on nights that do have moonlight. But it can fly in relatively total darkness. It has huge eyes. And then the one on the bottom is the nocturnal sweat bee, Megaloptogenalis, which is this large-bodied sweat bee that lives in these hollowed out sticks in the rainforest understory. And it has compound eyes that are almost 30 times more sensitive to light than the average worker honeybee. They also have whole pathways of neurons in their head that are devoted to processing that information coming in. So it's kind of like in the FBI when there's in a movie where characters like, stop, zoom in on that when they're looking at an image. And then somehow magically the image processing like makes it clearer. That's kind of how it works with this sweat bee. This nocturnal bee is processing a tiny amount of information and turning it into a clear picture that lets them fly in a dense rainforest understory when the light isn't there to help them out. So it's pretty incredible bee. So moving on to other types of nocturnal pollinators, just briefly going to talk beetles. Beetle pollination is really understudied relative to bees and moths. Some beetle pollination definitely occurs during the day, but many beetle species are often also active at night and might visit flowers. I'm thinking about like the goldenrod soldier beetle that you might see out on goldenrod flowers. It's probably moving pollen around. This is an example of a fly and beetle pollinated flower, specifically wild ginger, which is native up here in New England. The flowers are these really inconspicuous, dark colored flowers that are sitting at the base of the plant. They smell kind of like carrion, like a dead animal, and they stay open day and night and attract in flies and beetles to pollinate them. So I'm going to turn now and just do a deep dive into moths, because moths are really a major player in nocturnal pollination. So I'll go through these questions. What do they look like? What's their life history? What role do they play? And then I'll talk about some interesting species. Moths are extremely abundant and diverse. We have about 20,000 bee species in the world, about 3,600 bee species in the US. Moths, there's 160 species, 160,000 species that have been described worldwide, and probably well over that. There's also 11,000 species of moths just here in the US. So we have, not all moths are pollinators, not all moths are active at night. These numbers are for all moths, not just for nocturnal moths. How do you tell a butterfly apart from a moth? This is a question I get asked a lot by kids when I'm talking to them about insects. What's the difference between a moth and a butterfly? How can I tell? Well, they both belong to the same insect order, Lepidoptera, so they are quite similar looking. And here's what I'm giving you kind of the typical butterfly and the typical moth, the butterfly being flashy and colorful, and the moth being camouflaged and discreet and kind of brownish. So these kind of match a lot of the characteristics of many butterflies and moths, but not all. Here we have another drab insect and another flashy insect, but in this case, the drab insect is the butterfly. And the easiest way to tell is actually the antennae. The butterfly, the end of its antennae ends in a knob shape. It's called a clubbed antennae. The moth is on the right, its antennae is ending in a point. Some moths also have more feathery antennae, but they don't have knobs on the end of them. There we go, pictures. So let's look at this example again. In this case, the swallowtail has clubbed antennae, and you can't see the antennae on the moth, but this is what feathery antennae look like. So male moths can have larger and more feathery antennae than females. They're covered in lots of pheromone receptors so that they can detect and track down females by the trail of chemicals that they're releasing. So in adults, we can look at antennae. What about caterpillars? Here's a couple caterpillars you might be familiar with. We have tent caterpillar moths and a monarch butterfly in their larval stage. The moths are quite hairy, which is often seen in moth caterpillars, but not in butterflies. Those hairs on moss can cause some irritation. So as I told my son, don't touch hairy caterpillars. Now, both of these are smooth and there's no hair to go on. So unfortunately, there isn't always an obvious difference. The moth is on the left here and the butterfly is on the right. These are the hornworm caterpillars, the sphinx moths. But unfortunately, there's not an obvious difference between some butterfly and moth caterpillars. But if a caterpillar is fuzzy or hairy, then it is likely a moth, as there are no hairy butterfly larvae. There you go, that's the hornworm. So just to bring up moth diversity again, I just want to show you the variety of different shapes and sizes, different types of moths. This is a silhouette guide from bugguide.net that narrows down moth families by shape. The largest moth in the world is the Hercules moth. It's a wingspan that's almost a foot long. And then the smallest, oops, I guess I don't have a picture of that. Smallest are in the, are only about 3 millimeters long. So just to give you some interesting, colorful moths. So many moths are cryptic, which is another word for camouflaged. And a couple of cryptic moths that deserve a mention include the bird dropping moth on the left. They look like bird droppings. And then on the right is the peppered moth, which spends its day resting against tree trunks. And that moth has a really neat evolution story. It evolved rapidly to get darker during the Industrial Revolution, when soot and smoke were darkening the bark of the trees in the area where it lives in England. So the peppered moth became rapidly darker because of soot and smoke. Like butterflies and some other insects, moths undergo complete metamorphosis, which means their development includes 4 life stages. First being an egg that's laid on a host plant for the next stage to eat, or in the case of some moths, on a, down in the leaves. That egg hatches into a larva or a caterpillar. Those caterpillars go through multiple instars where the larva is growing and shedding its skin. Then it spins a cocoon for its pupal stage, and they can last in the cocoon stage for a long time until some kind of environmental condition cues their emergence, and then they are an adult. So that when they are an adult, they are finding a mate, laying eggs, and starting all over. The adult life stage for moths is often the shortest. Some species actually only live about 2 days, don't even have mouth parts because their sole purpose is just to find a mate, lay an egg. But others can live up to several months as adults and spend that time visiting flowers and pollinating them. One thing that we are probably all familiar with is the moth's affinity for everything light. They fly towards our light. We see them at the campground light. We see them at the street light. Why are they so obsessed with light? The leading theory is that they are traveling by something called transverse orientation, which means they are trying to migrate and find food by determining their location by moonlight, and they stay on course by keeping a fixed angle with the moon to stay in a straight line. This is the same way that sailors navigated using the North Star. So the sudden appearance of artificial lights after thousands of years traveling by transverse orientation didn't give moths enough time to adapt. When they're using a light source to navigate that is much closer than the moon, transverse orientation doesn't work, so they end up just running into the lights. Moths and the disrupted navigation that comes from artificial lighting have become the butt of a lot of jokes. When you spend all night flying chaotically around a stationary light instead of trying to find a mate or food, why are you like this? Some moths migrate north and south. They're migratory moths. Sorry, I should have said that first. There's migratory moths, just like there's migratory butterflies. Some migrate up and down in elevation, meaning they're moving up and down, let's say, the Rocky Mountains. The moon is a really important reference point for traveling moths. So one interesting migratory moth that you might not have heard of, but is an important migrator in Europe, is the silver Y moth. This moth is found in Europe. It's resident in North Africa, but some might migrate as far north as Finland. So how can a tiny moth fly such a great distance? These moths hitch rides on these fast, high altitude air currents that are mostly occurring at night, and they can travel hundreds of kilometers a night. Instead of a nose, moths have antennae to sense smells, and this sense of smell is used to locate flowers. used to locate host plants to lay eggs on. It's also used to find mates to reproduce with in the dark. As I said before, males are typically the ones that have these larger, more feathery antennae, and not just because female moths swoon at the sight of large antennae. Female moths are emitting pheromones, which the males have to use in order to find a mate. So their sense of smell is heightened with having these larger, more feathery antennae, and so males with those characteristics are more likely to sense a female before a male with a smaller antennae. This is also why heavily fragrant flowers are easier for moths to find at night. Most adult moths are generalists. They're visiting many of the same kinds of plants visited by bees during the daytime. Many are carrying pollen on their underbellies and can contribute to crop pollination of a variety of fruits and vegetables. There was a study in ag fields in England that looked at hundreds of moths and sampled the DNA of pollen from their underbellies and proboscis, their tongues, to figure out what flowers they'd been visiting. And so the nocturnal pollen transport network that they looked at contained over 100 moth species and dozens of plant species, including some that were visited frequently by daytime pollinators and some that were really only visited at night. So this is just a small peek into what's happening with pollination after dark. For every one study that we have currently on moths, there's 22 bee studies. So we have so much more to learn about this. Researchers are definitely working on other methods for studying these pollinators without having to sacrifice their sleep. They're looking at using time-lapse cameras and other sort of methods that mean they don't have to necessarily be out there looking at the flowers all the time. There was a study that was using these time-lapse cameras to look at red clover pollination, and they found that moths provide 34% of the total flower visits to red clover based on their nocturnal flower visits. So they've really been systematically overlooked in how much they're contributing. Another recent study found moths are pretty efficient pollinators of bramble flowers, so blackberries, raspberries. The study authors in this case put a little mesh bag around clusters of flowers and left them open either during the daytime or during the nighttime. And they found more insects were visiting the flowers open during the day, but nighttime pollinators actually deposited more pollen per visit. So they were very efficient. And it makes sense that moths could be good pollinators of some of these open flowers where they're coming onto them, moving around with their bodies. Some of these moths are really quite fluffy, and some actually exhibit a vibrating behavior to warm themselves up at night. That's kind of similar to, if you're familiar with buzz pollination, the behavior that some bees use to get more pollen out of flowers. So this is a photo of a fall armyworm moth, adult, vibrating her wings while she's visiting an apple flower at night. Fall armyworm moths can be pests of some crops and turf grass as caterpillars, but then pollinate other crops as adults. So there's more to their story than them just being a pest. They're actually one of the better pollinators of apples based on this apple study from Arkansas. Moths can also potentially be important for maintaining genetic diversity in plant populations across long distances. So female bees, we think of bees as our big pollinators, they build a nest below ground or maybe in a plant stem, and then they're foraging for pollen and nectar in the area around that nest. So some small bees might only travel a little ways from their nest, maybe a football field. Larger bees might go a mile or two, but either way, they're not moving pollen beyond that certain radius from their nest. Moths, on the other hand, don't have a nest. They can travel a long distance, potentially moving pollen between quite distant populations of the same kind of plant. So under the right conditions, migratory moths might fly a few hundred kilometers in a single night, and that might be really important for gene flow. There's also some neat species. Some moths and plants have very special relationships, like some of the plant and bee relationships we already know about, like squash plants and squash bees. But here's a yucca moth and a yucca flower. These moths exclusively pollinate plants in the yucca genus. Yuccas don't make nectar, so other pollinators have very little reason to be there. The yucca moth only lives for 2 days as an adult. It's one of those species that doesn't have mouth parts because it's so short-lived. So they mate inside a yucca flower, and then the female will purposefully gather flower, gather pollen from the flower, fly to a yucca plant, and then lay a few eggs on the ovary of the flower, and then intentionally pollinate it with the pollen that she carried with her from the first flower. So most moths, as we think of them, are incidental pollinators, accidentally pollinating things that they're moving around on while feeding. The yucca moth is a very intentional pollinator because she wants to create yucca fruit that her babies can then eat. So that's kind of a neat special story for moths and pollinators. This is another one. This is the giant hawk moth that is endemic to Madagascar. It was discovered in 1882, but its existence was actually predicted 20 years before that and nearly 6,000 miles away by Charles Darwin, who was sitting in his London office and looking at this unusual Star of Bethlehem orchid that he was sent by a colleague. This flower has a foot-long nectar spur, and the nectar is only at the very bottom of the nectar spur. And so Darwin wrote in a letter, "Good heavens, what insect can suck it?" And he predicted that there would be an insect with a foot-long tongue, or proboscis, that was a co-evolutionary partner. So 20 years later, they found this hawk moth, which lent support to Darwin's whole theory of co-evolution between plants and their pollinators. So just as we're starting to better understand the contribution of these nighttime pollinators to pollination of our wild plant networks, of our crop plants, there's also increasingly research finding and pointing to the negative impacts of light pollution and artificial light at night on nocturnal pollinator activity and plant reproduction. There was a study from Switzerland that looked at the pollination of thistle, a species of thistle with and without artificial lighting. They placed these mobile street lamps over plots of cabbage thistle that had never been exposed to artificial light at night, and then compared them to those that did not have lighting over them. The artificially lit plants saw 62% fewer visits from insects and 29% pollinator species, and produced significantly fewer fruits. So they were definitely inhibiting that kind of nighttime pollinator visits and pollination activity. So this is not only affecting moths, it's also disrupting other kinds of nocturnal pollinators. So let's turn to solutions also. There's some key actions we can take to conserve nocturnal pollinators. We can provide habitat or food and shelter. We can reduce artificial lighting around our houses and our communities. We can avoid pesticides, especially in and near insect habitat. And we can talk to our friends and neighbors and communities to spread the love of nighttime insects. As gardeners, we can take a variety of steps to create better habitat for nocturnal insects. The thing is here, you probably already have dozens, if not hundreds, of night active insects in your yard. And some of the general rules of thumb here are the same as for daytime pollinators. We want to increase plantings of native plants and decrease hard surfaces. And we want to plant a variety of native plant species. When you plant diversity, you attract diversity. We can also do more by doing less. This is one of my favorite parts of wildlife gardening. Less tidy yards are generally better for insects. So one of the easiest ways to make your garden better for moths is simply to stop working quite so hard. Moths and their caterpillars need fallen leaves, old stems, other plant debris to help them hide from predators and to provide good shelter and overwintering sites. So it can be helpful to delay cutting back old plants, the plants that grew this year, until the spring, rather than doing it in the fall, and to just generally be less tidy. By stopping working so hard and leaving the leaves and stems standing over the winter, you can give yourself a little pat on the back for gardening for wildlife and nocturnal pollinators. So we have lots of resources available on that, and I'm happy to take questions on it. There's also steps we can take that are a little bit more specific to nighttime pollinators. Artificial light at night is a significant threat to nighttime pollinators. It can disrupt their natural behaviors, their ability to navigate, and ultimately lead to them not being able to find a mate and then decline in their populations. And the thing is, a lot of that artificial light at night is actually not needed. We are daytime animals, we are sleeping. So the first step that I recommend for this, for your space, is just to go out at night and observe. Try to take an insect's perspective, remembering that they are many times more sensitive to tiny differences in light than we are. So what lighting do you see? Are you seeing the splash of light from the windows of your house into your garden? Do you or your neighbors have party lighting over the patio, vanity lighting on the exterior of your house? Is there an obvious street light or floodlight? What about sky glow from your city? So this is kind of a starting point for understanding your local environment. I also recently figured out that if I take a picture, using the night mode on my camera, it really highlights places where there is excess light in my environment. Just setting that on a 3-second or a 10-second timer makes it a lot more obvious where that pollution is coming from. The best way to protect moths and other nocturnal insects from light pollution is to reduce artificial light in both space and time. Since Avalon's coming to talk to you, I might not talk about this, but simply changing the light spectrum of artificial lighting from cold to warm and installing, red gel filters or red LEDs can be a good step for reducing some disruption to insects, as well as to our own mammalian circadian rhythms, but it's not the full solution for every insect. For fireflies, for example, light intensity and not the temperature of the light seems to be the main driver of disrupted mate finding. But that might be a question for Avalon because that's from her research. But more generally, we need to reduce the intensity of light pollution in the evening and at night, which just means turning lights off. There's also usually steps you can take for your own house or apartment, whether that's putting up curtains on the inside to help keep that splash of light from coming out into the garden, or putting motion detectors or timers on your outdoor lighting. So I would just take in the questions that you can ask yourself from the Dark Sky International. Does the lighting have a clear purpose? Is it needed? And is it targeted? There's a lot of lights you can probably keep off a lot of the time using a motion detector for when you need light. Thinking about something like moving from your driveway into your house, or the feeling of safety from lights turning on when there's motion outside. Those are both great scenarios for having your lights on a motion detector. And then the second best option would be dimming, hooding, or shielding outdoor lighting. And if you're in an HOA where you can't turn the lights off, going for an amber or red light to go as warm as possible on light temperature. Yeah. Then there's things we can do at the community or the state level to reduce lighting impacts on insects and other wildlife. The other group that is very affected by light at night includes migratory birds. Most migratory birds fly at night. Orioles, thrushes, sparrows, warblers, you name it, migratory bird, it's probably flying at night. Overly lit structures and landscapes can tempt birds into fatal building collisions. There's up to 1 billion birds killed by building collisions every year. And while we think about that happening at skyscrapers and other large buildings, those kill the most birds on a per building basis. Actually, individual residences cumulatively kill the most birds. So overuse of lighting at night is something we can be working on individually and also in community, which includes better lighting standards for street lights, requirements for commercial buildings, restrictions on vanity lighting. State and municipal standards can help reduce unnecessary lighting. I did want to highlight, this is from Lights Out Connecticut. Connecticut last year passed legislation to turn off non-essential outdoor lighting for state-owned buildings between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. to protect migratory birds during their migration. Boston also actually has a similar Lights Out program. But maybe you don't have lighting standards in place and you have street lights out there that are coming into your yard and you can't do anything about it. So there's a lot of places where there's outdoor lighting we can't control, but there are ways we can work to maybe create dark zones. If you think about light like a pollutant, how can you best protect your garden, your areas of habitat? Thinking about maybe planting a tree or a shrub to try and block or absorb artificial lighting from your neighbors or from that street light, just like you might plant dense vegetation to protect your pollinator garden from your neighbor's backyard pesticide application. So creating darker spaces with vegetation might help create some zones that are dark enough for nocturnal insects to be able to do what they need to do. Another important step in managing spaces for pollinators in the day or at night is limiting pesticide contamination. So just like for daytime pollinators, if we are planting attractive plantings for pollinators, we are also wanting to avoid pesticides in our yards and gardens. Many pesticides that are available for home and garden use are harmful to moths, fireflies, bees, nocturnal insects, and day active insects, including things like the backyard barrier treatments that are applied for mosquito and tick control, the granular treatments for grub control in lawns, many of which are systemic and can be taken up into plants nearby. Even things like structural treatments for termites can end up in plants that are around the foundations that have been treated for termites and affect the pollinators that are feeding on the nectar and pollen of those plants. So where we have attracted in these beautiful beneficial insects, we don't want to create a trap for them and then accidentally harden them with our pesticide applications. Part of managing gardens for moths and butterflies and bees is just shifting expectations about what that garden is going to look like. If you are gardening for wildlife, if you are planting native plants, signs of damage can mean that you're doing it right. Insects are using your garden. Your garden is food for wildlife. So learning to recognize and maybe take pictures of the insects that you find in your garden can help you find and identify the things you don't recognize. Suddenly you start to learn more and recognize how many different kinds of insects your garden can support. I also wanted to specifically mention bug zappers. These bug zappers are still manufactured and widely available, despite pretty overwhelming research that they are useless at controlling pests like mosquitoes. At the University of Florida, they put out a bug zapper that killed 10,000 insects in one test night, but only 8 of those 10,000 insects were actually mosquitoes. That research from the 1990s estimated that 4 million bug zappers were in use across the United States, operating for an average of 40 nights a year and killing an estimated 71 billion harmless or beneficial insects like moths. So these are okay for indoor use, but I would not use them outdoors. It's clear that nocturnal pollinators play important roles in plant communities and natural ecosystems, and we have so much more to learn about their relationships. What are they doing? Where are they going? What plants are they pollinating? What do they need for habitat? How can we support them? I am still learning just along with you about all of these things, but I hope that I have whetted your interest to go out there and find more information. And if you find that information, please share it with me too. If you are interested in observing night flying moths up close, you can go out and try and catch them on flowers, or there's a couple methods you can use to bring them right to you. So there's the light in a bucket method or the light on a sheet method. These are two kind of easy ways to observe moths at night. So if you're using a bucket, you can take like a cardboard egg container, put that inside a bucket, and then point a light source into the bucket. So the moths are attracted in and fly inside, go into the little egg carton and have little nooks and crannies to hide in. And then when you open that bucket up, you should have lots of moths to look at in there. For the sheet method, you can hang a white sheet outside away from other artificial lighting, ideally on a windless, dry evening, and then point a flashlight or other light source to illuminate the sheet. Summer tends to be the best time for viewing the greatest diversity of moths. I think July is the peak month for moth activity. But in any case, if you don't get moths coming to your sheet, it can at least be a cute sheet set for doing a play with shadow puppets with your dog, like my colleague Caitlin's dog Opal here. If you do capture photos from using either of these methods, highly recommend uploading them to iNaturalist or a community science app that can help with identification and document those species in your area. Especially same if you are out there looking for pollinators at night. These iNaturalist data sets are being used to generate things like native plant finders and species selection for pollinators, but really anything that's using a data set like that is going to be mostly looking at those daytime pollinators that are easy to photograph. So any more contributions that we can get from nighttime pollinators would be great for figuring out what kind of species these animals are using. So just wanted to, at that point, say thank you to our members who make presentations like this possible. Thank you to the Massachusetts Pollinator Network for having me. And I am happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was fascinating. Um, the bug zapper thing, that's just horrible. We don't even talk about bug zappers very often. I feel like that's just not even listed as something that's a problem, but it so
Yeah,
clearly is.
that was some of Doug Tallamy's early work in the 1990s.
Wow. Um, so we have some questions in the chat. I would also encourage people to use the raise hand function, which is under, oh boy, where is it? Is it under reactions? Yes, I believe, yes, it's under reactions. There's a little heart at the bottom of your screen. If you click that, you can raise your hand, or you can just raise your hand and wave it. But if you're on the second screen, I might not see you. So, or you can keep putting them in the chat and I'll read them out loud. Our first question from Flatbush Gardener is, could satellites affect nocturnal organisms? Thinking of those that might navigate by stars.
That's an interesting question. I don't know that satellites would have nearly the same level of light intensity or disruption as some of the other factors around them more immediately. I think artificial light at night that's coming from, the ground surface is going to be more impactful than the satellites. But with increasing number of space junk, I don't, I don't know. I will say one thing I didn't mention. When we're thinking about light pollution, it is really both space and time, but even something that's a point source, like a car that's driving through, or if you have a street that's pretty heavily trafficked, that point source can still be over time a fair amount of light pollution. I live on a highway. I would say I get probably a car every 2 minutes, but I imagine that's actually quite a bit of light disruption that's happening along the edges of that highway.
Right, yeah, interesting. Okay, our next question is from Caitlin. How can you tell if a moth or insect is pollinating a flower intentionally?
That would take a lot of observation. So the yucca moth was a story that was, captured by naturalists, by natural historians who were observing over time. I don't know that you could look at a plant and know that a moth just offhand is intentionally pollinating that plant. That would come from a longer term of observation of that species.
Rob, you have a question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to confirm one quick thing. So in terms of if we do have lighting and we lose the battle with other family members on it sometimes being on outside, it sounded like you said we should look for a specific light that is maybe amber or red or warm. And is that something easy enough to get? Will we just find it on Amazon or at a hardware store or something?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a specific source, but I would search amber light or red. If you're really trying to go for the least disruptive but still on, red gel filter, or a red light. Those are going to be the least disruptive to the most number of insects. If you're looking for something that doesn't maybe scare your neighbors, amber light is probably the way to go. The red light is a little bit Halloweeny.
Okay, thank you. And then could you possibly recommend, is there a specific few maybe flowers or shrubs that are particularly good for the night pollinators? Or maybe there's just a whole bunch of things that we already have in our garden that are also good, but I'd love to know if there's one or two native things that we could add to our garden possibly if we don't have it.
If you don't have evening primrose of any kind, definitely add evening primrose. That's where I would start. There's a couple of different species, but up here in New England, the Enithera biennis is just the most common evening primrose, readily available, and it's pretty cool. It actually just pops open right there in the evening. You can watch the flowers pop open. Yeah, I would start there. You probably do have some that are already accessible and available. Anything that is fragrant and remains open at night is likely also accessible to and interesting to nighttime pollinators. I think about even things like lilac are going to probably be visited by nighttime pollinators. I'm still working on developing my sort of New England list, but I would say by March, I should have a list together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll close real fast, I promise. I don't know if anybody has read this book or not. I just finished it. It's fantastic. And it talks about some of the things you mentioned and other things. So I highly recommend.
Rob, if you
Awesome.
want to throw that in the chat, the
Yeah, I
title.
will. I
Thank
will.
you.
Thank you.
Let's see, we have a question from Russ. I understand that a lot of insects like to hibernate and or live year-round under the ground. For those of us that have sufficient space to create or steward such habitat, how should we maintain the land to create favorable conditions for beneficial insects?
So I think this is where the leaving the leaves and doing less disruptive things is helpful. One of the things that I often get questions about is mulching. So if you are mulching, try and keep it light. Mulching does make it a little bit less, to make the ground habitat, the underground habitat, potentially a little bit less accessible. So leaving some areas either not mulched or lightly mulched. For leaving the leaves, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. But anything that ends up resulting in like a big pile of leaves is actually likely to compost or heat up that pile of leaves. So keeping those leaves relatively light in terms of, breaking them into a garden bed, not going more than a few inches deep on your leaf litter layer coming in from raking it in from the yard. But in general, I mean, keeping it a little bit messy, planting as many different kinds of plant families and species as you can, not doing a lot of tillage. You're gonna have plenty of space for those hibernating and underground insects. I hope that answers that question.
I have another question from Russ. What about indoor lights that leak out to the outside, for example, through windows where the shades have not been drawn? Is this a problem?
Yes. So I would definitely recommend going outside at night, looking around. For myself, I found I didn't have any outdoor lighting except for a motion detector from my driveway into my house. But going around to the back of the house, I realized, oh gosh, I need shades on some of these windows. So that was one of the first steps that I took, was just putting more curtains up inside and remembering to draw them, when I'm hanging out between when the sun goes down and when I go to bed.
Let's see. A request that you add native trees to your list of night pollinators. And the other part of that question is, how can we all get your list in March when it's ready?
Oh, good question. I'm going to be preparing it because I'm talking at the Vermont Flower Show, and they were very interested in having a plant list. So maybe I'll just see if I can get in touch with you, Renee.
That'd be great.
Remember to send you the list.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Happy to share that. Happy to see it
Yeah.
too.
And the other thing to think about with some of these moths is it's about the whole life cycle, right? There's the nectar part for the adults that are flying around when they're trying to feed and mate, but there's also the life cycle that there's the host plants, right? That their caterpillars are feeding in, that are connecting the whole cycle. So that might be trees that you don't think of as being pollinated trees that they are feeding on as caterpillars. So those are very important contributors. I mean, oaks, maples, willows, all of those are going to have caterpillars hosted on them that have adult moths that are flying around and pollinating later on.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you for the book recommendation.
Yeah.
I will definitely check that out.
Okay. So let's see, I will throw these these reminders on meetings upcoming in the chat one more time. Ooh, the spacing's terrible. I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. Reminder, we don't have a December meeting for presentation, but in the evening we do have our brown bag lunch at the very beginning, the 4th, I believe, at noon. Thank you, Emily, so much. This was just fantastic, and I'm so glad that you were able to present to us. And then,
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this topic.
Well, anytime, and then we can't wait to get your list when it's ready. Oh, Peggy, are you waving or raising your hand? Waving. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.